Chapter 1. When the agency boss slid a business card across, Ethan had only 47 yuan left in his pocket. The boss sat with one leg over the other, not even lifting his eyelids. Rich family's daughter wants a male nanny. 15,000 a month, room and board included. Yuan, 15,000. Ethan did the math in his head. 3 months, and he'd have enough to pay for the wedding banquet for him and Lily back home. He hesitated for 2 seconds. Male nanny sounded odd. But the fridge had been empty for 3 days, and the landlord called to chase the rent 3 times a day. He had no right to be picky. I'll do it. Only then did the agency boss lift his eyes, appraise him from head to toe, and nod. You're the right one. They've been picky for a long time, couldn't find a single suitable person. Ethan didn't think much about what that remark meant. At 2 in the afternoon, he found a villa by the address. To be precise, it was the one deepest inside the villa compound. The iron gate rose 3 meters high. 2 men in black suits stood at the entrance, expressionless like 2 stone statues. Ethan, yes, I'm here to... Come with me. The bodyguard turned and walked away. His tone was less like someone introducing a job and more like someone escorting a prisoner. Ethan followed behind, passing through the neatly trimmed garden and entering the villa's front door. The living room was 6 times larger than his rented apartment. Crystal chandelier, genuine leather sofas, floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass of the windows was a bit odd. From the outside it looked dark, you couldn't see anything. Mrs. waiting for you. The bodyguard stopped at the living room doorway and stepped aside. Ethan walked in, then froze. The girl in the wheelchair tilted her head and looked at him. She was probably 18 or 19, wearing a white dress, clutching a pink plush rabbit. Her long hair fell over her shoulders, her face small as a palm, her eyes round and bright like 2 washed grapes. Beautiful. That was Ethan's first reaction. What a pity. That was his second. Are you the new big brother? She spoke, her voice soft and a little slurred, like a child who'd only just learned to talk, trying hard to shape the words. Yes, I'm Ethan. She held out her hand. Ethan bent down to shake it. Her palm was soft, warm, much smaller than he'd imagined. Then her fingers tightened. It wasn't the force a child uses to grab something. It was different, like she was afraid he'd run away, her knuckles white, her nails digging into the back of his hand. You came. She smiled, showing 2 small fangs. You're not leaving, right? Ethan's hand hurt a little from the grip, but he still nodded. I'm not leaving. Her hand relaxed. She became that little girl again who hugged a rabbit, tilted her head, and had an innocent look in her eyes, as if the moment before had been only his imagination. Being a nanny was both simpler and more exhausting than Ethan had imagined. Simpler because Serafina, her name was Serafina, though it took him 3 days to remember it since she herself was never clear about it, basically never went out. Her daily radius was the living room, the dining room, and the bedroom. More exhausting because she couldn't be away from someone for a moment. She needed him to feed her. She would raise the spoon in her mouth and then put it down, pouting, "Brother, feed me," her eyes shining as she looked at him. Ethan sighed, took the spoon, and fed her mouthful by mouthful. When she chewed, her cheeks puffed up like a hamster's. She needed him to push her when they went out. She sat in her wheelchair, both hands clinging to the hem of his shirt, grabbing wherever she could as they moved. Once when he went to the kitchen for water, she refused to let go, and in the end he had to push her with one hand and pour the water with the other. She needed him with her at bedtime more than anything. He carried her to bed. She was so light, it was unreal, tucked the blanket around her, and was just about to leave when she grabbed his sleeve. "Brother, tell a story." He couldn't tell stories, so he made one up as he went. Halfway through, she fell asleep, her hand still gripping his sleeve. On the 3rd night, Ethan was doing the dishes in the kitchen when Serafina appeared in the doorway, pushing the wheelchair herself. She didn't know how she had managed to push it over. He was usually the one to push her. She tilted her head. "Brother, do you have a girlfriend?" There was still foam on Ethan's hands. He answered without thinking, "Yes." Serafina said nothing. Ethan looked back at her and found her staring at the floor, her hands clutching the rabbit a little tighter. "What's wrong?" She looked up and smiled again. Nothing. Brother, keep washing the dishes. I'll watch you. She really did sit there watching him wash. Watching until he put the last bowl back on the rack. Ethan felt there was something odd about the whole scene, but he couldn't say what. Serafina was just a disabled little girl. It was normal for her to depend on those who cared for her, right? Late at night, he returned to his room and called Lily. "How was your day?" Lily's voice sounded a little tired. She'd been working overtime a lot recently. "Not bad. Just looked after a little girl. She was very well behaved." "What little girl?" "The employer's daughter. Her legs aren't convenient, and her mind, not smart. Quite pitiable." There was silence on the other end of the phone for a few seconds. Ethan asked, "What's wrong?" Lily's voice softened. "Nothing. It's just something feels off. Be careful." "Don't worry. What can a little girl in a wheelchair possibly do to me?" Ethan hung up the phone and turned to wash up. At the end of the corridor, Serafina's bedroom door was cracked open. In the darkness, a pair of eyes watched him. He didn't notice. Chapter 2. A week later, Ethan had grown used to the rhythm of the villa. Get up at 7 in the morning, wash Serafina's face, and brush her teeth. Feed her breakfast at 8. She insisted he feed her, refusing to open her mouth until the spoon reached her lips, and when she was done, she wanted him to wipe the milk from the corners of her mouth. At 9, he pushed her into the garden to sunbathe. She sat in her wheelchair holding a rabbit, tilting her head to watch the butterflies. Lunch at noon. In the afternoon, he kept her company watching cartoons. She liked the ones with very bright colors, and when something was funny, she would clap the armrest and laugh. Supper in the evening, then coax her to sleep. Brother. She began calling him brother on the third day. Ethan had corrected her twice to no avail. She kept calling him that. Brother, tell a story. Brother, wait. Brother, don't go. She clung to the hem of his coat, as if it were a lifeline. Sometimes Ethan wondered if she was too clingy. Then he thought again. A disabled, simple-minded little girl who grew up without her parents and was raised only by a nanny. It's only natural she'd be a bit clingy. He didn't dislike her. He even felt a little sorry for her. But he couldn't ignore Lily. That noon, Ethan was in the kitchen cutting fruit when his phone rang. Lily's name lit up the screen. He was about to answer when a hand reached over and pressed the end call button. Serafina sat in the wheelchair. She didn't know when it had been pushed over. Her fingers were still resting on the screen, her eyes fixed on him, her lips pressed into a line. "Don't answer it." Her voice wasn't as muffled as usual. It was startlingly clear. Ethan froze for a moment. "How come you?" "You're mine." She snatched the phone, hid it behind her, pouting. "You can't take other people's calls." Her expression returned to that of a coquettish little girl, but her eyes, only for a moment, flashed a cold light. Ethan carried the fruit plate out and didn't ask any more questions. That night, back in his room, he checked his phone and saw several missed calls and messages from Lily marked red. He hadn't opened them. He checked the call log again and found Lily's number had been added to the blacklist. Ethan stared at the screen, a chill running down his spine. Who had been on his phone? He removed the number from the blacklist and sent Lily a message. "Sorry, I was busy earlier. I'll call you tonight." The next day, Serafina found out. How she found out Ethan still couldn't figure out. He hadn't used his phone in front of her. The message had been sent late at night, and there was no way she could have seen it. But she just knew. That afternoon, Ethan pushed her back to the bedroom and had just set her on the bed when she suddenly asked, "Did you contact her again?" Ethan's hand froze in midair. That woman. Serafina's voice changed, no longer coquettish, but another kind, cold, flat, as if stating a fact. Lily. Ethan was stunned. How did she know Lily's name? The next second, Serafina grabbed her left hand and bit down. Her teeth sank into the flesh of her forearm with a muffled tearing sound. Blood flowed from the corner of her mouth, staining the white sleeve red. Ew. Ethan panicked, lunging forward to pry her mouth open. "What are you doing?" She looked up, her face drenched in tears, eyes so red they seemed about to bleed. "Are you going to leave me? Are you going to abandon me?" "I'm not." "Then delete her," she screamed, her voice sharp. "Delete her number. Delete her messages. You must not contact her." Ethan looked at the bite marks on her arm. Blood was still seeping, staining a patch of her sleeve. Her tears mixed with blood, smearing half her face. He didn't know what to do. Okay, I'll delete it. He took out his phone and, in front of her, deleted Lily's number. Serafina's crying stopped. She looked up, wiped her face with her sleeve, and showed a smile. Brother, you're the best. Ethan watched her and felt that something was off. But she was right. He couldn't abandon her. She was a pitiable child, wasn't she? That night, after Serafina fell asleep, Ethan slipped out of the villa. He went to see Lily. Lily's place was a 40-minute drive from the villa district. Ethan hailed a taxi and got out at the entrance to the complex. Lily's rented room was on the 6th floor with no elevator. He climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. The door opened. Lily stood in the doorway, much thinner, with dark bluish shadows under her eyes. She froze for a moment. Ethan, what are you doing here? Just came to check on you. Ethan walked in and looked around. The room was small, things piled in a mess, a half-eaten takeout box on the table. How have you been lately? Lily sat on the edge of the bed, head bowed. I'm okay. Just working a lot of overtime. You're thinner. Ethan sat down beside her and took her hand. Her hand was cold. Her nails were cut very short, no longer painted the pale pink they used to be. He lowered his voice. Lily, my employer, seems a bit strange. Lily looked up, her eyes flickering. How strange. She says her legs are bad and that she's not very smart, but I always feel the things she says, the things she does, sometimes don't seem like a fool. Lily was silent for a few seconds. Ethan, have you ever thought that she might not be what you say? What do you mean? Nothing. Lily shook her head. Be careful. If it gets too bad, just quit. Ethan squeezed her hand. I'm saving up. Once I have enough, I'll take you away. Hold on a little longer. Lily looked at him, her eyes a little red. She didn't say anything. Ethan stayed away for half an hour, then hurried back to the villa. He didn't want Serafina to find him gone. He froze when he pushed open his bedroom door. Serafina was sitting on his bed. The room was dark. She sat in the shadows, clutching that pink plush rabbit and tilting her head as she looked at him. Where did brother go? Her voice was soft, as if asking what the weather was like today. I've been waiting for a long time. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. How did you? Sunshine Garden Complex, Building 6, 6th floor, Apartment 402. Serafina gave the address, each word deliberate. You were there for 32 minutes. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Why, how did you know? Serafina didn't answer. She stood up, not from the wheelchair, but from the bed, and walked over to him. She was taller than he had imagined. Brother, she tilted her head and smiled. Do you think I know nothing at all? Ethan took a step back. Serafina sat back at her wheelchair, clutching the rabbit, regaining that innocent look. Where did brother go? I'm so scared. I'm so scared being alone in a room. Ethan stood in the doorway, his palms slick with sweat. How did she know Lily's address? How did she know how long he'd stayed? Isn't she paralyzed? Isn't she an idiot? He looked at her and found that she was looking at him, her eyes bright and clear like two washed grapes. Just like when they first met. Innocent, pure, clean. But Ethan suddenly felt that those eyes were hiding something else. Chapter 3. Ethan hadn't slept all night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind filled with the image of Serafina standing up and walking toward him. Isn't she paralyzed? Isn't she an idiot? How did she know Lily's address? How would she know how long he stayed? Do you think I know nothing at all? That sentence was like a thorn stuck in his mind. He couldn't pull it out. At dawn, Ethan made a decision. He was going to quit. He called Lily. It rang for a long time before she answered. Her voice was weary, as if she had just fallen asleep and been roused. Ethan, he lowered his voice. Lily, I quit today. Can you take the afternoon off? Meet me at the high-speed rail station, and let's go back to our hometown together. There was a few seconds of silence on the other end. Now? Yes, now. I can't stay here any longer. That place, that person, something's wrong. Lily didn't speak, and then Ethan heard her inhale. Okay, 3 in the afternoon, at the high-speed rail station waiting hall. I'll wait for you. Fine. He hung up and went to knock on Serafina's door. No one answered. He pushed the door open and found the room empty. The bed was neatly made. A plush rabbit sat beside the pillow, and a wheelchair stood by the window. She wasn't there. Ethan went downstairs and asked the bodyguard. The bodyguard said the young lady had gone out and would return in the afternoon. He breathed a sigh of relief. Better this way. He could pack his things and leave immediately. He went back to his room, shoved a few clothes into his backpack, then went to the kitchen to grab some bread and water. He didn't know how long the ride would be or what he would do when he got back to his hometown, but he knew he had to get away from here. Before leaving, he called the agency boss and said there was family business and he was quitting. The agency boss didn't say much, just made a brief and hung up. Ethan found that a little odd, but he didn't think much of it. He just wanted to leave. At 2 in the afternoon, Ethan arrived at the high-speed rail station. He bought 2 tickets, one for himself and one for Lily. The departure time was 4 o'clock. He sat in the waiting hall, watching people come and go. Young mothers with children, students dragging suitcases, men in suits talking on their phones. Everyone was rushing somewhere. Everyone had somewhere to be. Ethan wanted to go somewhere too. A place without Serafina. 2:30. Lily still hadn't arrived. Ethan called her. It rang for a long time, but no one answered. He called again. Still no answer. 3 o'clock. Lily still hadn't come. Ethan began to panic. He stood up, walked to the doorway of the waiting hall, and scanned the area. There was no sign of Lily. He kept calling. This time, the phone shut off entirely. 3:20. Departure time was approaching. Ethan stood at the ticket gate, holding 2 tickets, his palms slick with sweat. Lily wouldn't stand him up without a reason. She had promised him. Unless. He didn't dare to think any further. 3:40. The high-speed train pulled away. Ethan refunded his ticket and stood in the waiting hall, not knowing what to do. He sent Lily more than a dozen messages. None answered. He called her, but it was switched off. Did something happen to her? Or did she not want to go with him? Ethan stepped out of the high-speed rail station and stood under the streetlight, watching the stream of cars come and go. It was already dark, the wind a little cold, and he was wearing only a thin jacket. Ethan, he heard someone call his name. He turned his head and saw a woman in a beige trench coat standing not far away. She was tall, her long hair draped over her shoulders, her face very pale, her lips very red. She was not in a wheelchair. She stood perfectly straight. Ethan was stunned for 3 seconds before he recognized that face. It was Serafina, but not the Serafina he knew. She wasn't clutching a stuffed rabbit. She wasn't tilting her head. She didn't call him brother in a muffled voice. She stood there, smiling, her gaze calm, as if looking at something that belonged to her. Ethan's voice tightened. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you." Serafina walked over. Her high heels clicked crisply on the floor. "You quit without saying goodbye. I'm a little hurt." Ethan took a step back. You're not supposed to have bad legs." Serafina looked down at her legs, then smiled. She looked up. "My legs are bad? Who told you that?" You're in a wheelchair, aren't you?" "You aren't." "An idiot?" Serafina finished his sentence, her tone like she was teasing. "Yes, I told you. But did you ever think why I told you that?" Ethan's mind went blank. He looked at her standing before him, at her without the wheelchair, at her speaking with a clear, normal, adult voice. You lied to me?" "Lied to you?" Serafina tilted her head, the motion exactly the same as when she sat in the wheelchair. "No, I just didn't tell you the whole truth." She stepped in front of him, reached out, and straightened his collar. "Ethan, have you ever wondered why you lost your job?" Ethan was stunned. "What? Before you were laid off, you sent out so many resumes. Why didn't you get a single interview?" Ethan remembered. During those months after he lost his job, he had sent out dozens of resumes, but each time it was like sending them into the void. He had assumed it was just bad luck or an economic downer. The agency owner, why did he say, "You're the one the moment he saw you"? Serafina's voice was soft, like telling a bedtime story. He searched for a long time. Why couldn't he find anyone suitable? And yet he chose you of all people. Ethan felt the blood drain cold in his veins. "Because you're the one I picked." Serafina smiled, revealing 2 small tiger teeth. "From the day you lost your job, everything was under my control. You couldn't find employment because I told those companies not to hire you. You went to the employment agency because I told the boss to pull up your file. You became my nanny because I wanted you to be my nanny. She leaned closer to him, her voice growing softer. Do you think your life belongs to you? Ethan stepped back and hit the railing behind him. You're insane. Maybe. Serafina wasn't angry. She only looked at him, her gaze terrifyingly tender. But I got what I wanted. You. She turned and waved toward a black sedan parked at the curb. The car door opened and two bodyguards climbed down. Serafina said, Take Ethan home. He's tired. The bodyguards grabbed Ethan's arms and hauled him toward the car. Ethan struggled. Let me go. I'm not going back. This is kidnapping. Serafina turned around and looked at him. Kidnapping. She laughed. Ethan, you're the nanny I hired. You resigned to leave. I asked you to stay. How is that kidnapping? She stepped in front of him and reached out to touch his face. Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. Her fingers were cold, like a snake slithering across his skin. I just want you to stay with me forever. Ethan was pushed into the car, the door shut, cutting off the sound from outside. He looked through the car window and saw Serafina standing under the streetlight, waving at him. Her smile was beautiful, so beautiful it sent a chill through him. Goodbye, brother. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. No, that's wrong. Goodbye, mine. Chapter 4. The car drove for a long time. Ethan was wedged between two bodyguards, unable to move. Outside the window, it was pitch dark. Streetlights slipped by one after another, like a countdown. He didn't know where to go. Serafina sat in the front seat, not looking back, not speaking. Her back was very straight. Long hair draped over her shoulders, a world apart from the girl in the wheelchair, holding a rabbit. The car stopped at the villa's gate. The bodyguards helped Ethan out, carried him through the garden and into the house. The living room lights were on. The crystal chandelier's glare made Ethan squint. Take him to the basement. Serafina's voice came from behind. Ethan's heart jumped. The basement. The bodyguard pushed him deeper into the corridor. At the end of the hall was a door. Behind it, a staircase led down. The stairs were long, growing darker the farther down they went, and the air grew colder. The door closed behind him, cutting off the light from above. The basement was much larger than Ethan had imagined. He had expected to find a damp, shadowy cell, but what lay before him was a room. All four walls were mirrors. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its light refracting in the mirrors and multiplying Ethan's reflection countless times. In the center stood a large bed, white sheets, white pillows, a white duvet. Nearby were bookshelves, a sound system, even a small kitchenette. Like a meticulously arranged bedroom. Like a cage. This was prepared for you. Ethan turned his head and saw Serafina standing in the doorway. She had changed into a white silk nightgown, her long hair spilling over her shoulders, barefoot on the carpet. You. Ethan's voice tightened. What are you going to do? Serafina came in and shut the door. I'm not doing anything. I just want you to stay. This is imprisonment. You can call the police. Call the police? Serafina laughed. Ethan, you're the nanny I hired. You live in my house, sleep in the room I prepared for you. Does that count as imprisonment? She walked up to him, reached out, and lightly touched his face. Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. Her fingers were still so cold, like a snake crawling over his skin. I like you too much. Ethan took a step back, his back hitting the mirror. His pale face was reflected there, and Serafina's smile behind him. You love me. His voice was hoarse. You love me, and you want to ruin my life? Ruin? Serafina tilted her head. I didn't ruin you. I just brought you to my side. She walked to the edge of the bed and sat down, patting the spot beside her. Sit. Ethan didn't move. Sit. Her voice was gentle, but carried an unmistakable command. Ethan walked over slowly and stopped about 2 meters away from her. Serafina smiled, as if looking at a disobedient child. The first time I saw you, it was on a rainy day. Ethan was momentarily stunned. 3 months ago, Serafina continued, you were helping an old man with his car by the roadside. The man's tricycle had tipped over and his things were scattered everywhere. You braved the rain, picking them up one by one, and even helped push his cart home. Ethan remembered. It had been pouring that day. He passed an alley and saw an old man struggling in the rain. He didn't think twice and went over to help. "I followed you," she said. "Watched you the whole way. You got him home and were soaked through yourself, but you were smiling." She looked up at Ethan. "In that moment I thought, this man has to belong to me." Ethan's spine went cold. You followed me?" "Not followed." Serafina shook her head. "I watched. I had to be sure you were worth my time to win." She rose and walked to stand in front of Ethan. "Later I realized you were worth it. You're kind, responsible, and devoted in love. You have a childhood sweetheart, and you two plan to return to your hometown to get married." Her voice was frighteningly gentle. "But Ethan, have you ever wondered why I had to destroy all of that?" Ethan said nothing. "Because those things would take you away from me." Serafina reached out and gently stroked his face. "Your job, your girlfriend, your hometown, your future, those are all obstacles. I removed the obstacles for you. You should be grateful to me." "You're insane." Ethan's voice shook. "You're completely, utterly mad." "Maybe." Serafina wasn't angry. She just looked at him, her gaze as tender as if she were looking at a precious treasure. "But I don't care. I have you, and that's what matters most." She turned and walked to the bookshelf, picking up a tablet. "By the way, do you want to know why Lily didn't come?" Ethan's heart jolted. Serafina walked over and handed him the tablet. On the screen was a video. Ethan took it and pressed play. The video shows a luxury apartment. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city's nightscape spreads out, and a warm yellow lamp glows inside the room. A woman sits on the sofa, wearing a designer dress, holding a glass of red wine. It's Lily, but not the Lily he knew. She is thinner than before, her makeup heavy, her hair permed into waves. She leans against the sofa, and beside her sits a stranger, his arm draped over her shoulders. The man leans in and says something. Lily laughs, but the smile is hollow, as if she's completing a task. The video was short, only a few dozen seconds. But Ethan watched it for a long time. His hand was shaking. How could she? She chose a better life. Serafina's voice was soft. That man is very rich. He bought her a house, a car, and many, many things she couldn't afford before. Ethan looked up and stared at Serafina. What did you do?" Serafina smiled. "I didn't do anything. She chose for herself." She took the tablet from Ethan's hand and set it aside. "Look, Ethan, she's not worth your longing. She chose money, chose a better life, not you." Ethan said nothing. He looked at himself in the mirror, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Lily chose someone else? He couldn't believe it. But the video he'd just seen, the Lily in a designer dress, sipping red wine, leaning against a stranger, that didn't look like she was being forced. It was voluntary. "I need time." His voice was soft, as if speaking to himself. "You have all the time in the world." Serafina stepped in front of him and looped her arms around his neck. "Here, you have so much time." Her body pressed against his, breath warm against his ear. "From now on, you belong only to me." Ethan didn't push her away. He simply stood there, looking at the two people in the mirror, him and her, like a painting, like a cage. Chapter 5. Ethan didn't know how long he'd been in the basement. There were no windows, no way to tell day from night. Only that crystal lamp, always lit. He looked thinner in the mirror, the shadows under his eyes growing darker. Serafina came every day. She changed into different clothes, sometimes white silk pajamas, sometimes a pale blue dress. She brought him food, talked with him, tending to him like a pet. She would ask, "What do you want to eat today?" Ethan didn't answer. She decided for them both. "Then let's have fish. You like fish, don't you?" She seemed to know all his preferences. What he liked to eat, what he didn't, when he went to bed, when he got up, what movies he liked to watch, what songs he liked to listen to. She knew everything. Ethan said nothing. He simply ate the food she had brought. He needed strength. He needed to wait for an opportunity. The opportunity came on the 7th day. That night, after Serafina left, she forgot to lock the door. Ethan waited a long time, making sure there was no sound in the corridor before pushing the door open. The door opened, truly opened. He couldn't believe his luck. Barefoot, he climbed the stairs. The hallway was very quiet. The servants were all asleep. He crossed the living room, pushed open the back door, and rushed into the night. No one pursued him. He didn't dare stop. He ran all the way to the main road and hailed a taxi. The driver asked, "Where to?" "Sunshine Garden Residential Complex." Ethan gave Lily's address. The cab drove for 40 minutes. Ethan sat in the back seat, staring out at the pitch-black night, his heart pounding as if it would burst through his chest. Lily. He had to see her. He had to ask her if that video was real. Had she really chosen someone else? The car stopped at the entrance to the residential compound. Ethan paid and rushed inside. He remembered Lily's address. Building 6, 6th floor, apartment 402. He climbed the stairs, stood at the door, and knocked. No one answered. He knocked again. "Lily, it's me, Ethan." Footsteps came from inside, and then the door opened a crack. Lily stood behind the door, wearing an oversized t-shirt, her hair a mess, her face pale. Her voice was hoarse. "Ethan, how did you?" "I escaped." Ethan pushed the door open and stepped in. "Lily, I saw that video." Lily tried to push him back out. "You shouldn't be here. Go now, she'll find out." Ethan grabbed her wrist. "I'm not leaving." "Lily, tell me the truth. What's going on with that video? Did you really choose someone else?" Lily looked at him, her eyes rimmed with red. "Ethan, tell me." She was silent for a long time, then let go of his hand and went to sit on the edge of the sofa. Ethan followed and sat opposite her. Lily's voice was very soft. "That man was arranged by Serafina." Ethan froze. "What?" Lily lowered her head, her voice trembling. "I was assaulted. That night, after I got off work and went home, someone followed me. I thought I was imagining it, but he grabbed me." Ethan clenched his fists. "He took photos, he took videos." Lily's voice grew softer. "He said if I didn't do as he said, he'd send those things to my parents, to you, Ethan, and post them online. And then..." Ethan's voice was hoarse. "And then..." Lily looked up, her eyes full of tears. "He took me to see someone. A woman. Serafina." Lily nodded. She sat there, looking at me as if she were looking at an object. She said, "You won't go with me." She said, "I'm no longer clean." Ethan wanted to speak, but his throat felt blocked. Lily's voice dropped lower. "After that man bought me a house, a car, clothes, and bags. He said that as long as I behaved, I could have a good life." She looked at Ethan, her gaze hollow. "At first I didn't want to. I wanted to go with you, to go back home. But what? But I'm used to it. I'm used to not squeezing into the subway, used to wearing designer brands, used to living in a big house. Ethan, I don't want to go back home and suffer." Ethan looked at her, looked at the girl he had loved for more than 10 years. She was thinner, her makeup heavy, her eyes hollow. But he still recognized her. He reached out and took her hand. "Lily, I can forgive you. We can start over." Lily looked up at him. "Ethan." Ethan stood up. "Come with me. Leave now. We'll go somewhere she can't find us." Lily didn't move. "Lily." She stood up, went to the door, and opened it. "You should leave." Ethan froze. "What?" "I don't want to go back." "Ethan, what's the use of you forgiving me? I don't want to return to my hometown. I'm used to being here." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but none fell. "I'm sorry." Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. "Lily, go. Don't let her find you." Ethan wanted to speak, but his throat felt as if it were blocked. He watched Lily's back, watched her standing there, motionless. Then he turned and walked out the door. The corridor was very quiet. He heard crying coming from the room, but the door did not open again. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, not knowing where to go. Lily chose someone else. He lost everything. He pulled out his phone, wanted to call someone, but found only a few numbers in his contacts, his parents, former colleagues, and he deleted that name. Serafina. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and turned toward the gate of the complex. He didn't know where to go. He just wanted to get away from the city. Footsteps came from behind. More than one person. He turned and saw several men in black suits emerging from the shadows. "Mr. Ethan, the lady is waiting for you." Ethan wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were filled with lead. He couldn't move. Chapter 6. Ethan was locked back into the basement. This time, the lock had been changed. Serafina stood in the doorway, looking at him as if at a lost cat. You want to see her. I don't blame you. You're just not used to it yet. Ethan sat on the bed, saying nothing. Serafina crouched, reached out, and lifted his chin. But Ethan, if you run off again, I won't just lock you back up. Her gaze was gentle, but Ethan saw what lay beneath that gentleness. It was a kind of resolve with no limits. Control had been upgraded. Before, Serafina came once a day. Now she came 3 times a day. Morning to bring breakfast, noon to bring lunch, evening to bring dinner plus chatting. She sat on the edge of the bed, talking about her life, about the things she liked, about her plans for him. She said, "We can live here. I'll buy the books you like. What do you like to read? I can have them delivered." Ethan said nothing. "You like eating fish. I had someone make your favorite, steamed sea bass." She seemed to know all his preferences. What he liked to eat, what he didn't like, what time he went to bed, what time he got up. She knew everything. Sometimes she would stay in the basement until very late, lying next to Ethan, holding his arm. "Ethan, did you know, when I was little there was no one to keep me company. Mom and Dad were always abroad, and the house only had servants. The servants wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't hold me, wouldn't soothe me to sleep." Ethan didn't move. "I don't know what normal love looks like. All I know is that whatever I want, I must get, no matter what it takes." Ethan still didn't speak. Serafina turned over and looked at him. "Do you think I'm frightening?" Ethan finally spoke. "You ruined a girl's life." "Which girl?" Serafina tilted her head. "Lily. She was assaulted. That man took photos and threatened her. Her life is over." Serafina thought for a moment, then said, "She has you. That in itself is the greatest hurt to me." Ethan looked at her, unable to speak. She wasn't arguing. She was stating a fact. In her eyes, Lily possessing Ethan was itself a sin. "You are a demon." Ethan's voice was hoarse. "I just love you too much. To have you, no price is too high to pay." She stood up and walked to the door. "Get some rest. I'll bring you braised spare ribs tomorrow." The door closed. The click of the lock echoed through the basement. Ethan sat on the bed, staring at himself in the mirror. He had lost a lot of weight. His face was pale, with deep shadows under his eyes. "She loved you too much. Whatever the cost, it was worth it." He repeated her words in his head, each one feeling like a blade. A few days later, Ethan heard a sound through the crack in the door. No sooner had Serafina left than 2 servants' voices came from outside the door. They thought he couldn't hear, but the basement door didn't muffle sound. "That girl called Lily is pitiful. It's her own fault for getting in Mrs. Way." "That man, was he arranged by Miss?" "Of course. Even the photos were taken at Mrs.' request." Ethan felt his blood run ice cold in an instant. Lily's violation, from beginning to end, had been orchestrated by Serafina. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't that man's own idea. It was Serafina. She was the one who arranged for people to assault Lily. She was the one who had photos taken to blackmail them. She was the one who destroyed Lily's life, who ruined his relationship with Lily. Everything, from his unemployment to Lily's tragedy, had been carefully plotted by that woman. Ethan's hand trembled, but this time it wasn't fear. It was anger. That night, Serafina came, as usual, to deliver dinner. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, watching her walk in. "Lily being assaulted was arranged by you." It was not a question. Serafina halted, glanced at him, then smiled. "Who told you? Was it you?" Serafina did not deny it. She set the tray on the table, walked over to Ethan, crouched down, and looked at him. "Yes." One word. No defense, no explanation, no apology. "You're a devil." Ethan's voice trembled. "I know, but I don't care." She walked to the door, turned back. "Ethan, you can hate me, but hate is still an emotion, isn't it? As long as you feel something, you won't truly want to leave me." The door closed. Ethan sat in the dark, his fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. She was mad, utterly, completely mad. But he couldn't stay here any longer. He began to seriously look for a way to escape. The door lock was new. He couldn't pick it. There were no windows in the basement. but he discovered a vent in the corner of the ceiling. It was small, but big enough for a person to squeeze through. He spent 3 days. Every night after Serafina left, he used a metal plate pried from a serving tray to unscrew the vent screws. On the 3rd night, he climbed the bookshelf and crawled into the vent. The pipe was narrow. He was practically wedged and crawling forward. Dust made him cough. The metal scraped his skin, but he didn't dare stop. The pipe led to the villa's back garden. He crawled out through the vent and fell onto the lawn. The night wind blew over him as he sucked in big, ragged breaths. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. He climbed over the garden wall and ran out onto the main road. This time he didn't take a cab, didn't go to the station. He walked along the highway for a long, long way until he saw a truck parked at the roadside for a rest. He knocked on the window. "Can I get a ride?" "Anywhere will do." The driver glanced at him, a gaunt, dusty young man who'd lost all semblance of himself. "Get in." Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, watching the villa in the rearview mirror grow more distant. He would never go back. He swore it. Chapter 7. The truck driver dropped Ethan off at the junction of a small county town. He handed him a bottle of water. "Kid, where are you headed?" Ethan took the water. "I don't know. Somewhere nobody knows me." The driver glanced at him, asked no more, and drove off. Ethan stood at the crossroads, looking at the small town before him. The street was narrow, the shop signs on both sides crooked. Some sold breakfast, some sold hardware, some sold clothes. There weren't many people, mostly old folks and children. Completely different from the city he came from. He found a cheap inn and stayed one night. The next day, he walked around the town and found a job, washing dishes at a small restaurant. The pay wasn't high, but it was enough for food and lodging. He changed his phone number, stopped using WeChat, didn't post to moments, and tried not to leave a trace. Every night he had nightmares. In the dreams, there was the basement mirror, Serafina's smile, Lily's hollow eyes. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, then sit on the bed and watch the moonlight outside the window until dawn. But the days were slowly getting better. A month later, he moved out of the little inn and rented a small house. The house was very old, the plaster peeling, the windows drafty, but he thought it was 10,000 times better than the basement with the mirror. Half a year later, he moved from dishwasher to kitchen assistant. The boss saw he was diligent and began teaching him how to chop and stir-fry. A year later, he had saved a little money and bought a second-hand electric bike, riding it to work every day. He began to get used to life here. He got used to the early morning sunlight, to the soy milk and fried dough sticks from the street breakfast stalls, to the lengthened shadows cast by the streetlights as he rode his electric bike home at night. Sometimes he would catch sight of a tall woman's figure on the street, and his heart would skip a beat. But when she turned around, it wasn't her. He told himself she could no longer find him. 2 years later, he met a girl at the market. Her name was Grace. She sold vegetables at the market. Her smile was warm, her voice soft and gentle, completely different from Serafina. Ethan began going to her stall often to buy vegetables. At first, he only bought produce. Later, they exchanged a few more words, and after that, he would help her pack up and walk her home. She never questioned his past. She simply kept him company in silence, like a lamp illuminating the hollow in his heart. One day, she asked him, "Ethan, would you be willing to be my boyfriend?" He looked at her, looked for a long time. Then he nodded. Falling in love is simple. Eating together, walking together, watching movies together. She liked romantic films. He accompanied her, even though he thought those movies were fake. She liked sweets, so he learned to make sweet and sour spare ribs. He began to think that maybe life could start over. Once, he saw the silhouette of a tall woman on the street and broke out in a cold sweat at once. He stood where he was, watching that figure disappear into the crowd, his heart pounding as if it would burst through his chest. Grace came over and took his hand. "What's wrong?" He took a deep breath. "It's nothing. I took a wrong turn." He told himself it was an illusion. She could no longer find him. 3 years later, Grace, proposed. She nodded through her tears and said, yes. The wedding was simple. They only invited a few friends. He wore a borrowed suit. She wore a white wedding dress, and they got their marriage certificate at the town civil affairs office. That evening, they returned to the new apartment, a small place he had saved up for 3 years to buy. Not big, but enough for two. He looked at her in the wedding dress, standing under the light, and felt his life was fulfilled. "I'll give you a surprise." She picked up a tie from the table and smiled as she walked toward him. "What surprise?" "Close your eyes." He closed his eyes. He felt her hand wrap around his wrist, and then the tie bound his hands. He opened his eyes and smiled. "What are you?" Then he heard that voice. Not Grace's voice. It was the other voice he had thought he'd never hear again. Gentle, soft, with a trace of teasing. "Long time no see, brother." Ethan's smile froze. He looked at the woman in front of him. She wore a white wedding dress, her long hair draped over her shoulders, and it was still that face, Grace's face. But her expression changed. In those eyes, there was no longer Grace's warmth. It was something else. Innocence, sweetness, madness. The thing he knew all too well. His voice tightened. You're... Who am I?" She tilted her head. The movement was exactly the same as when she sat in the wheelchair. "I'm Grace, your wife." She leaned down and whispered in his ear, "It's Serafina, too." Ethan's blood ran cold in an instant. "You how?" "I've been searching for 3 years. I searched for 3 years, every single day." She stood up, took a photograph from the nightstand, and handed it to him. The photo was of Serafina, the original Serafina, long hair, small face, 2 little fangs. She said, "I spent so much money to change my face. But it's okay, I'm still me." She smiled, showing her 2 little fangs. "See, Ethan, I told you so." Her hand caressed his face, like a snake slithering across his skin. "No matter the cost, I will have you." Moonlight streamed through the window, casting the 2 of them in shadow. One of them sat on the bed with hands bound, face pale. A woman in a wedding dress stood before him, her smile sweet. Like a painting, like a cage. Chapter 8. Ethan tried to break free, but the tie was cinched tight. "Let go of me." "Let go of you?" "Ethan, we've only just gotten married, and you're already leaving?" Her tone was gentle, but there was something else in her eyes. It was that kind of boundless determination he knew all too well. Ethan's voice trembled. "Are you insane? You spent 3 years, change your face just so." "Just for you." Serafina finished his sentence. "Yes, just for you." She walked to the bedside table, opened a drawer, and took out a photograph. In the photo was her former self. Long hair, a small face, 2 little tiger teeth. Sitting in a wheelchair, holding a pink plush rabbit. She handed the photo to Ethan. "Look, this is what I used to look like." "Pretty." Ethan looked at the photo, at the girl sitting in a wheelchair, tilting her head, her gaze innocent. That was how she had looked the first time he met her. His voice was hoarse. How'd you find me?" "I changed my number, I don't." She walked up to him, crouched down, and looked at him. "And then I found you." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. 3 years. She had looked for 3 years. Every single day. "You think you can run?" "Ethan, from the day I decided I wanted you, you were doomed to never escape." She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the moonlight. "Do you know what's the most ironic thing? The person you fell in love with was me." Ethan was stunned. "The person you fell in love with was Grace," Serafina laughed. "But Grace is me. No matter what I look like, no matter what name I go by, the one you loved was me." She walked up to him, leaned down, and whispered in his ear, "So you see, you've never really left me." Ethan wanted to speak, but his throat felt blocked. He looked at the woman in front of him, wearing a wedding dress, her long hair over her shoulders, a sweet smile on her face. She was not Grace. She had never been Grace. She was just Serafina with a different face. You're not love. You're imprisonment. What's the difference? You're by my side. That's love." She walked to the bedside table and reached under the pillow. Ethan looked at her hand, not knowing what she was going to take. She took something out. It was a small box. A black velvet box, like the kind jewelry comes in. She opened the box, and inside was a ring. Silver, very thin, set with a tiny diamond. She took the ring out, walked over to Ethan, and said, "This is the wedding gift I prepared for you. Put on." and you'll be mine forever. Ethan looked at the ring, looked at the smile on her face. Innocent, sweet, crazy. I don't. Serafina didn't wait for him to speak. She slipped the ring onto his ring finger. The ring was tight, as if it had been welded to his finger. All right, now you belong to me. Forever. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the moonlight outside. Ethan, do you know, when I was a child, there was no one with me. My parents were always abroad. Only servants were at home. If I wanted something, they would buy it for me, but there was no one to talk to, no one to hold me, no one to love me. She turned around and looked at him. I don't know what normal love looks like. I only know that what I want, I must have, by any means necessary. She stepped in front of him, reached out, and gently stroked his face. It's okay if you hate me. Hatred is a kind of feeling, isn't it? Her hand glided across his cheek, along his jaw, and down to his neck. As long as you're by my side, I don't care what you feel. She leaned over and whispered in his ear, this time we'll never be apart. Moonlight streamed in through the window, casting the shadows of the two of them. One was bound hand and foot, sitting on the bed, face pale, a silver ring on his ring finger. The other wore a wedding dress, standing before him, smiling sweetly, her gaze terrifyingly tender. Ethan stared at himself in the mirror. The wardrobe doors in the new flat were mirrored, reflecting his face. Pale, hollow, despairing. He remembered the first time he met Serafina. She sat in a wheelchair, clutching a pink plush rabbit, tilting her head as she looked at him. You came. You're not leaving, are you? He said, I'm not leaving. Now, 3 years later, she stood in front of him, wearing a wedding dress, wearing a ring, her smile still so sweet. This time, we will never part. Ethan wanted to speak, but no word would come out. What could he possibly say? He ran for 3 years, changed cities, changed jobs, changed his life, even fell in love with someone new. But in the end, he realized the new person was still her. He had never escaped. From the very beginning, he was never meant to get away. Moonlight glinted on the ring. The diamond flashed. Like an eye, it watched him in the darkness.